Imagine a place so beautiful it hurts to look at, yet one cabin on a quiet South Carolina plantation was never left alone. Not for a single night. Not for 37 years. Something inside that crooked door was alive. And someone was willing to damn their soul to keep it hidden. There are places that refuse to speak. Not because their stories have faded into the soil, but because men spent decades pressing their hands over the mouth of history itself, choking every whisper until silence became law. If you have ever driven the back roads of South Carolina's lowcountry at that golden hour when the light slants sideways through the live oaks, you know the feeling. The Spanish moss hangs like gray funeral veils. The river glints the color of old pewter. The air smells of wet earth, pine resin, and something sweeter, jasmine, maybe, or the faint rot of things that once lived and now feed the cotton. It is breathtaking. It is also unbearable once you understand what the land has swallowed. Because beauty and evil have never been strangers here. They have always worn the same face. Somewhere along an unmarked stretch of that lowcountry, on land erased from every public map, stripped of any name that might lead you back, stood Heron's Bluff Plantation. It was never the biggest. Never the richest. The big house was handsome but plain, white clapboard glowing under the sun like a lie told with perfect manners. The fields produced steady cotton, not miracles. The man who owned it was neither tyrant nor saint. He was something far more dangerous, ordinary. Yet for nearly 40 years, one single cabin, the last one in the row, set a little apart near the tree line with its crooked door and oilcloth window, was guarded every hour of every day. Rain or drought. Harvest or flood. Peace or the chaos of war. Someone always stood at that door. The overseers changed. The seasons turned. The land itself changed hands twice. But the watch never ended. No one who worked those fields was ever told why. The few who asked, never asked twice. This is not a ghost story. Ghosts are easy. They moan, they rattle chains, they vanish at dawn. What happened at Heron's Bluff was worse. It was the story of what ordinary men will do when they believe God isn't watching. And what happens when, after 4 decades of perfect silence, someone finally listens. Before we step onto that land, you need to feel the world that made such a secret not only possible, but inevitable. South Carolina in the 1820s was a kingdom built on 2 things, cotton and silence. The rivers ran wide and slow, the color of tea left too long in the pot. Live oaks older than the nation itself arched overhead like cathedral ceilings, their branches dripping moss that swayed in the breeze like the robes of forgotten priests. Fields of cotton stretched white and endless, a frozen sea that would one day make men rich and other men property. But underneath the beauty lay a weight no map could show. By 1825, enslaved black people outnumbered free white citizens in the state. The entire economy, every road, every port, every silk dress in Charleston, every vote cast in Washington rested on the bent backs of men, women, and children legally listed in ledgers as chattel. The planter class did not whisper this truth in shame. They proclaimed it from pulpits. They printed it in newspapers. They carved it into the very language they spoke, natural order, divine institution, the curse of Ham. They opened their Bibles with clean hands and found verses that let them sleep at night. They were wrong. But they were powerful. The plantation system was not merely economic. It was a complete universe. A closed circle of law, custom, whip, and prayer that told every soul, white or black, exactly where they could stand, what they could say, and which questions would get them killed. It was a world engineered so that certain truths could never escape. Because if they did, the entire elegant, cruel machine would collapse. Into this world, in the early 1820s, Heron's Bluff was born. The land, 1,400 acres of rich coastal loam, had belonged to the Vance family since the 1790s. Old Gerald Vance, a hard-eyed Scots-Irishman, had bought it cheap from a ruined rice planter and turned it into steady cotton profit. He died in 1818 of a sudden fever that burned through him like judgment. He left everything to his eldest son, Harlan Vance, 26 years old, already married, already a father, already carrying the quiet certainty that the world belonged to men who kept good accounts and asked no unnecessary questions. Harlan Vance was not a monster in the way storybooks draw them. He did not whip slaves for sport. He did not drink himself blind. He attended the little white Episcopal church 3 miles down the road every Sunday, hat in hand, voice steady on the hymns. He sat on the county agricultural board. He wrote polite letters about soil drainage and seed varieties. He loved his wife, Eleanor, in the stiff, dutiful way of his class. He buried 2 of their 4 children without public display of grief. By every visible measure, Harlan Vance was the ideal Southern gentleman, methodical, restrained, respectable. But there was one detail that made even his neighbors tilt their heads, just slightly. He kept a guard, day and night, on the last cabin in the Slave Row. At first, in the late 1820s, it was easy to dismiss. A man leaning against the wall, smoking. You might think he was resting between tasks. You might think he was watching the fields. But if you passed the same spot at dusk, he was still there. Midnight, he was still there. Dawn, still there. The cabin itself looked ordinary, rough-hewn pine, single oilcloth window, door hanging a little crooked on iron hinges. No extra lock. No markings. Nothing to draw the eye. Except the man who never left. The enslaved people who lived in the other 7 cabins learned the rules without ever being told. Children who drifted too close were snatched back by their mothers with a grip that said more than any words could. Men who let their eyes linger too long on that cabin found themselves assigned to the worst labor the next morning, ditch digging in the swamp, clearing cypress knees knee-deep in black water, work that broke lungs and backs before age 35. The message was never spoken. It didn't need to be. The silence itself was the lash. White overseers were given a simple story: storage. Medicines. Important papers. Mr. Vance doesn't want thieves. Most accepted it. A few noticed that the storage cabin required a living guard even when every able body was needed in the fields. A few heard things at night they could not name. But wages were paid on time, and Mr. Vance's eyes had a way of settling on a man that made further questions feel suddenly unwise. For nearly 2 decades the arrangement held. The guard changed, sometimes a white man, sometimes a trusted enslaved driver given a sliver of authority in exchange for his soul, but the post was never empty. Not once. Then, in the spring of 1843, everything began to tilt. A new overseer arrived named Thomas Aldridge. 31 years old. Virginia-born. Practical. The kind of man who believed problems had solutions and secrets were just facts that hadn't been organized yet. He had come south for better wages and, he said in letters home, a change of air. He had no strong opinions about slavery, it was simply the world as it was. He came to work, not to wonder. Harlan Vance met him on the wide veranda of the big house, shook his hand firmly, and gave him the tour with the calm efficiency of a man who had done it many times. Fields. Gin house. Barns. Quarters. Rules. Quotas. The other overseer, Garrett, who spoke little and saw less. When they reached the Slave Row 8 identical cabins, each with small personal touches added by the people who lived inside, a painted gourd, a carved wooden cross, a handful of marigolds struggling in the dirt, Aldridge noticed the guard. A heavy-set black man named Cato stood with arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing. His posture said this was not rest. This was duty. Aldridge asked the obvious question, "What's kept in that one?" Vance did not slow down. Did not look at the cabin. Did not look at Cato. He answered in the same tone a man uses to say the sun will rise tomorrow. "That cabin is mine, Mr. Aldridge. Your concern is the fields." The words landed like a door shutting on a room you were never meant to enter. Aldridge let it go. He had a job. He threw himself into the spring planting with the focus of a man who measured his worth in acres cleared in pounds of cotton ginned. He learned the rhythms of the place. He learned the names and tempers of the people he drove. He was firm but not sadistic, a distinction that passed for mercy in that world. But the cabin stayed in his mind like a sore tooth. And then, one warm April night 3 weeks after his arrival, he heard it. He was walking back from the livestock barn under a clear sky. The kind of night when every sound travels too far. Crickets. A distant owl. the creak of the big house settling on its bones. He passed the end of the slave row and the sound stopped him cold. From inside the last cabin came something low, rhythmic, and utterly unnatural. Not a cry. Not words. Not even a moan that a man could name. It was a slow, steady rocking. The creak of weight shifting back and forth, in a space too small for pacing. Patient. Mechanical. Like something had been doing it for so many years that the floorboards had learned the shape of its despair. Aldridge froze. The guard that night, a younger man this time, stared straight ahead with the flat, empty eyes of someone who had been taught that his only job was to see nothing. The rocking continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like a cradle that had never held a child. Like a prayer with no hope of answer. Like the slow, relentless heartbeat of a sin that refused to die. Aldridge stood in the dark, the warm southern night suddenly cold against his skin, and for the first time since arriving at Heron's Bluff he understood something he could not yet put into words. Whatever was inside that cabin had been alive for a very long time. And whatever it was, it had never been meant to be seen by the light of day. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere, in the distance, a night bird called once sharp, lonely, like a warning that had come far too late. The rocking never stopped. Back and forth. Back and forth. It was the sound of a living thing that had discovered the only motion left to it in a world that had taken everything else away, and had repeated that motion until the motion itself became the creature. A heartbeat made of wood and despair. A prayer without words. A slow, endless erosion of the soul against the floorboards of a cabin no bigger than a grave. Thomas Aldridge could not unhear it. In the months that followed his first encounter with that sound, he began to watch the cabin with the quiet obsession of a man who knows he is stepping onto dangerous ground but cannot turn back. He studied the guard rotation the way other men studied scripture or ledgers. The men chosen for the post were never the same 2 nights in a row. Never. It was deliberate. A calculated policy to ensure no single soul accumulated too much forbidden knowledge. Only the most trusted workers were selected, men who had proven over years of silent labor their absolute capacity for obedience and discretion. Men whose eyes had learned to look away from what they were not meant to see. When the guard changed at dawn and at dusk, no words were ever spoken. Just a long, heavy look passed between the outgoing and incoming man. A look that carried weight. A look that said, "You know what this is. Keep it buried." Then the first man would walk away without glancing back, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the night had left something clinging to his skin. Harland Vance himself visited the cabin alone, almost every week, always in the pale hush of early morning before the plantation fully stirred. He would slip inside for 20 minutes, perhaps 30, then emerge again. His face when he stepped back into the light was always the same, perfectly blank. Not angry. Not relieved. Not haunted. Simply empty, the face of a man who had long ago decided that feeling anything about his duty was a luxury he could no longer afford. The face of a man performing maintenance on a machine that happened to be human. By June of 1843, after 3 months at Heron's Bluff, Thomas Aldridge had reached a conclusion that unsettled him deeply. Whatever lived inside that cabin was alive. And it had been alive for a very long time. The official story of Heron's Bluff was clean, respectable, and utterly false. Gerald Vance had founded it. Harland had inherited it. The plantation ran like clockwork, cotton planted, harvested, ginned, shipped. Church on Sundays. Balanced accounts. Cordial neighbors. A model of Southern order. The real story began in the winter of 1821, shortly after young Harland Vance, barely 26, had taken full control following his father's sudden death. That was the season the older workers spoke of only in whispers and careful, coded phrases. They called it simply the change. Before the change, the last cabin in the row had been like any other, occupied by a family, or shared by field hands. After the change, it was emptied overnight. The people who had lived there were quietly moved to other cabins with no explanation, no discussion, no choice. And then the guard began. Day and night. Unbroken. For more than 20 years. The oldest soul on the plantation when Aldridge arrived was an elderly woman named Nance. Somewhere between 70 and 80 years old, no one knew exactly. Birth records for the enslaved were often incomplete or non-existent. She had been at Heron's Bluff since before Harlan Vance was born. Too frail now for fieldwork, she spent her days in a weathered rocking chair outside her own cabin, shelling beans, mending clothes, or simply sitting in that profound stillness that comes to those who have outlived their own expectations of life. Her eyes had seen generations rise and fall. They carried the quiet power of someone who had learned exactly how much truth the world could bear and exactly when to withhold the rest. Aldridge approached her slowly, over many weeks, with small, careful kindnesses, an extra portion of cornmeal, a scrap of good cloth, a length of strong thread. Nothing flashy. Nothing that could be seen as bribery. Just the sort of small human gestures a decent overseer might offer an old woman. He knew he was not the first white man to try this. Nance knew it too. She measured him with those ancient eyes, deciding in real time how much of her burden she would share. What she finally gave him, in fragments spread across the humid summer of 1843, was this. In the winter she called the bad winter, 2 or 3 years after old Gerald Vance died, Harlan Vance had brought something to the plantation. Not someone. Something. She used the word deliberately, watching Aldridge's face to see how he would react. Testing him. It had arrived at night, in a wagon covered with heavy canvas, long after the hands were asleep. 2 strangers, men she had never seen before and never saw again, carried it into the last cabin under cover of darkness. Then the guard began. Aldridge pressed her. What was it? Nance looked at him for a long moment. The late summer light hung thick and golden over the fields, turning the cotton bolls into glowing lanterns. A mockingbird sang its endless, mechanical song somewhere in the trees. The air smelled of warm pine resin, drying earth, and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, almost gentle. I only know what I heard. And what I heard was a child. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. A child. Aldridge sat with the revelation, turning it over in his mind, searching for some rational explanation that fit the brutal logic of the world he knew. A child born with a deformity? A child prone to violent fits? A child born of a forbidden union that Harlan Vance needed to hide from his wife, his neighbors, his church? A child that represented some threat to the family name, the inheritance. The fragile social order? All of it was possible in the South of 1843. None of it fully satisfied him. Because no ordinary hidden child required a guard every single night for 20 unbroken years. Harlan Vance wasn't merely hiding this child. He was containing it. Managing it. Feeding it. Visiting it with the same methodical precision he applied to crop rotation and equipment repair. And he did it with the quiet terror of a man who feared not the thing itself, but what would happen if the world ever discovered its existence. Aldridge was a practical man. He told himself this often. Practical men did not chase ghosts or indulge in wild speculation. Yet the cabin had burrowed under his skin. By late summer, he had begun doing something he knew was dangerous. He began to watch. Carefully. Casually. Never obviously. He adjusted his evening rounds so they took him past the far end of the slave row more often than necessary. He noted the exact times of the guard changes, always at dawn, always at dusk, always wordless. He mapped which trusted men were assigned to which nights. Never the same man twice in a row. Never anyone new. Never anyone known to talk too freely with white overseers. He also tracked Harlan Vance's visits. They increased noticeably whenever the ordinary rhythm of plantation life was disturbed, a birth, a death, a visiting neighbor, the arrival of a new field hand. Anything that altered the texture of daily existence seemed to pull Vance back to that cabin, sometimes twice in 1 week. This told Aldridge something chilling. Whatever lived inside that cabin was aware of the world beyond its walls. Or at least, Harlan Vance believed it was. He wasn't just feeding or checking on a prisoner. He was managing something that needed to be soothed, warned, or reassured when the outside world shifted. In September 1843, Harlan's younger brother, apprentice Vance, arrived unexpectedly from Charleston. The two brothers were not close. Their greeting on the veranda was stiff, formal, cold. Harlan had told no one on the plantation that his brother was coming. During the 2 weeks apprentice stayed, Harlan visited the guarded cabin every single day, sometimes twice. On the third night of the visit, Aldridge positioned himself near the main house veranda and overheard part of a heated conversation between the brothers. He was not proud of eavesdropping. He would later note in private letters how ungentlemanly it felt. But he heard enough to change everything. Apprentice's voice was low, urgent, strained, the voice of a man who had carried a secret too long. "We cannot continue this way, Harlan. It has been 20 years. People will eventually." Harlan's reply was flat, final, like a stone sealing a tomb. "No one will know. No one has known. And no one will." A pause. The scrape of a chair on wood. Then apprentice again, quieter, almost pleading. "And when you're gone? What then? What happens when you're no longer here to manage it?" Harlan's answer came without hesitation, without emotion. "That is not your concern. It has never been your concern." Aldridge slipped away into the darkness, heart pounding. 20 years. Harlan had said it himself. And his own brother, living 30 miles away in Charleston, had been carrying the knowledge of this secret for all that time, terrified not of the thing inside the cabin, but of what would happen when Harlan could no longer keep it contained. Aldridge returned to Nance the following week. He told her what he had overheard. He asked her directly now, not whose child, but what had happened to the child. Was it still alive? Nance looked at him for a long time. The September light was lower, richer, carrying the first hint of autumn. The mockingbird had gone quiet. The air felt heavier. "Still there," she said at last. "Still in that cabin." "How do you know?" Aldridge asked. She looked at him as if the question were almost childish. "Because the guard is still there," she answered simply. The guard stops when what's inside stops. The meaning was clear, and it chilled him. The guard was not just security. It was a living signal. As long as a man stood at that door, whoever was inside that cabin was still breathing. The guard was the only acknowledgement the entire visible world of Heron's Bluff ever gave that the person in that cabin existed at all. And it had existed there, in darkness and silence, for 20 years. If you're still listening, and I know many of you are, because this kind of truth clings to the soul, let me ask you something. Do you think Harlan Vance believed, deep in his heart, that he was doing the right thing? That he was protecting his family, his name, his God-given order? Or do you think every single morning, when he walked to that cabin with his blank face and steady step, he knew exactly what kind of man he had become? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because the winter of 1843 is coming, and what Thomas Aldridge did next changed everything. That winter arrived early and hard in the lowcountry. By November the fields lay stripped and brown, the cotton long since harvested, ginned, and shipped downriver to Charleston. The plantation settled into the slower, colder rhythm of repair, mending fences, sharpening tools, patching roofs against the coming rains. The days grew short. The nights stretched long, dark, and bitter. Cold air rolled off the river like judgment, sinking into the bones of the houses, the trees, and the hollow spaces between a man's thoughts. It was in this deep, watchful quiet that Thomas Aldridge made his mistake. By then he had been at Heron's Bluff for 8 months. 8 months of watching. 8 months of unanswered questions. 8 months of that rhythmic rocking haunting the edges of his sleep. The compulsion had grown beyond reason. He told himself he only wanted to look. Just a glance. Not to interfere. Not to enter. Just to see through the small tear in the old oilcloth window he had noticed weeks earlier. If he stood at the right angle, in the right light, perhaps he could finally answer the question that now consumed him. He chose a night in late November. The guard was a young man named Reuben, who had a habit in the coldest hours before dawn of pulling his coat high around his ears and letting his eyes drift half-closed against the sleep that pulled at him. Aldridge waited until well past midnight. The plantation slept. The only sounds were the wind sighing through the live oaks and the distant, mournful call of an owl somewhere deep in the tree line. He moved like a shadow, keeping to the darker edges of the slave row, his breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. His heart hammered against his ribs. He reached the cabin. Reuben was still awake, but his head had begun to nod. The oilcloth window waited, its small tear like an invitation from hell itself. And for the first time in 20 years, someone outside Harlan Vance's chosen circle was about to look inside the guarded cabin at Heron's Bluff. What Aldridge saw in the thin sliver of moonlight would haunt him for the rest of his life. And it would set in motion a chain of events that no amount of silence, no number of guards, and no amount of prayer could ever contain again. The rocking had a face. Thomas Aldridge had miscalculated. Or perhaps Reuben, the young guard, had simply been more alert than usual that bitter November night. Or maybe some deeper instinct, the same instinct that had kept men alive on that plantation for decades, had kept the guard's eyes open just long enough. Whatever the reason, Reuben stood facing the fields instead of the cabin. Aldridge seized the moment. He pressed himself flat against the rough pine wall of the last cabin, heart slamming against his ribs, breath fogging in the brutal cold. The kind of cold that crept into your bones and made every finger feel thick and useless. He waited. 1 minute. 2. The silence pressed down like judgment. Then he moved. He found the small tear in the old oilcloth window, the one he had noticed weeks earlier and tried to forget. He leaned in, eye to the ragged hole, barely breathing. Inside, the cabin was lit by a single tallow candle set on a low wooden table. The flame burned low and wavering, throwing more shadow than light. The corners of the small room dissolved into absolute blackness. But it was enough. More than enough. The cabin was not empty. In the far corner, on a low pallet covered with a rough but clean blanket, sat a figure. Knees drawn tight to chest. Arms wrapped around the legs. The posture of someone who had long ago learned that the smaller you make yourself, the safer you might remain. And it was rocking. That same slow, relentless rhythm Aldridge had heard so many nights, back and forth, back and forth. The only motion left to a soul that had been denied every other form of movement, every other expression of being alive. The motion of a creature that had turned its own body into a cradle, a prison, and a prayer all at once. Aldridge could not see the face clearly at first. The figure was turned slightly away, toward the darkest corner, as if it had spent years training itself to face only shadow. But he could see enough. The proportions were those of an adult, broad shoulders, long legs folded against the chest, a grown man's frame. Yet the posture, the tight clutching of knees, the gentle, childlike rocking, these belonged to a small child who had never been granted the space, the touch, the words, the world necessary to become anything else. The clothing was plain but clean. Not rags. Not the filth of neglect. Someone, Harlan Vance himself, most likely had maintained this person in a state of basic physical survival. Federal clothed. Kept alive with the same methodical care he gave to his tools, his ledgers, his cotton gin. This was not ordinary cruelty. This was something colder. This was maintenance. The careful, deliberate preservation of a living secret that was never allowed to live. Then, without warning, the rocking stopped. The stillness was sudden and absolute, like a clock whose gears had finally seized. One moment the motion existed. The next, it simply vanished. In the heavy silence that followed, the figure slowly, very slowly, turned its head toward the window. Aldridge jerked back. He slammed his body against the cabin wall, certain he had been seen, certain Reuben would turn, certain the entire fragile world of Heron's Bluff was about to explode around him. He stood frozen, not breathing, listening for footsteps, for shouts, for the end of everything. Nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been minutes, the rocking began again. Slow. Rhythmic. Patient. The sound of a soul returning to the only comfort it had ever known. Aldridge walked back to the overseer's quarters through the freezing dark. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot staring at the rough ceiling beams, turning the image over and over in his mind like a man examining a wound he cannot stop touching. An adult body with the soul and posture of a child. Kept in darkness and silence for 20 years. Guarded like a dangerous animal. Maintained like expensive equipment. He thought of Nance's quiet words, "The guard stops when what's inside stops." He thought of Apprentice Vance's pleading voice on the veranda. He thought of Harlan Vance's perfectly blank face every time he emerged from that cabin, the face of a man who had trained himself to feel nothing because feeling anything would have destroyed him. And he thought of the figure in the corner, stopping its rocking the instant it sensed something at the window. Turning its head with the slow, patient attention of something that had been waiting perhaps for decades, for someone, anyone, to finally look. The next morning, Thomas Aldridge made a decision that would shatter the long silence of Heron's Bluff. He did not write to Harlan Vance. He did not speak to anyone in the county whose loyalty belonged to the planter class. Instead, he wrote to a man named Reverend Clement Oakes, a Methodist preacher in the small town of Mill Haven, about 20 miles north. Oakes had a carefully guarded reputation, a man who could be trusted with difficult truths. He was not an open abolitionist, no one could survive long in 1843 South Carolina by being one, but he was known among a quiet network of souls as a man who believed some things were wrong no matter what the law or the Bible had been twisted to justify. Aldridge did not tell him everything. He told him enough. The guarded cabin. The constant watch. The figure he had seen rocking in the candlelight. Nance's fragments. The conversation between the Vance brothers. The pattern of Harlan's visits that suggested the secret inside was aware of the outside world. He sealed the letter with wax, handed it to a traveling merchant with a small coin, and waited. December passed. January dragged on in cold, watchful silence. Harlan Vance seemed slightly more alert during those weeks. His morning surveys of the plantation carried a new tension, eyes scanning not just for broken fences or lazy hands, but for something out of place. Something that might have shifted. Aldridge gave him nothing to find. Then, in late January 1844, Reverend Clement Oakes arrived at Heron's Bluff under the innocent pretext of a pastoral visit. Planters often allowed such visits. They kept the enslaved population calmer, more obedient, more resigned to their God-given place. The visit appeared perfectly ordinary. But in a brief 4-minute conversation behind the barn while horses were watered and the other overseer was occupied elsewhere, Oakes spoke quickly and clearly. He had done his own quiet investigation. He had spoken, carefully and indirectly, to former workers, merchants, even a Charleston physician who had been called to the plantation over the years. What he had pieced together made Aldridge's blood run cold. In the winter of 1821, a child had been born at Heron's Bluff to an enslaved woman named Delilah. She died shortly after childbirth complications, the sparse record said, in the vague way records of enslaved deaths always were. The child survived. And according to the whispers Oakes had gathered, the father was Harlan Vance himself. In the antebellum South, such children were tragically common. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was so routine it barely raised eyebrows among white society. These children occupied a hellish limbo, legally enslaved like their mothers, yet carrying the blood of the planter class in a world built on the absolute fiction that the two races must never mix. Most were sold away, sent to other plantations, or simply ignored. The system had many quiet ways of making them disappear. But Harlan Vance had done something different. The child had been born with a face that made denial impossible. The resemblance to Harlan Vance was unmistakable, not the kind that could be politely overlooked, but the kind that would destroy the careful fiction of Southern respectability. So Vance had not sold the boy. He had not sent him away. He had not done any of the things other planters did to erase such inconveniences. Instead, he had built a prison. He had placed the child in the last cabin, posted a guard, and kept him there, hidden from the world, from his wife Eleanor, from the church, from the agricultural board, from the Pratt family whose social standing was so valuable to him. Why not simply kill the child? Reverend Oakes had a theory that was both horrifyingly ordinary and deeply chilling in its plausibility. Eleanor Vance came from a far more prominent family than the Vances. Her father had been a state legislator. Her brother was a judge. The Pratt name opened doors Harlan could never have opened alone. Losing her or her family's favor would have meant losing everything he had carefully built. Eleanor was a woman of her time and class, trained from birth to maintain the sacred fiction that certain things simply did not happen. She would never have tolerated the living proof of her husband's sin walking the grounds. So Harlan Vance chose the path of a methodical, respectable man. He hid the boy. He maintained him. He guarded the secret with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every other part of plantation life. The guard was never there to protect the child from the world. The guard was there to protect the world from the child. Spring of 1844 arrived with indecent beauty. Azaleas bloomed in extravagant pink and white along the drive. The cotton fields turned tender green. The air carried the sweet promise of renewal. Thomas Aldridge felt none of it. Over the winter months, he and Reverend Oakes had exchanged careful, coded letters. Together with a small network in Charleston, a lawyer, a physician named Dr. Ansel Webb, and others whose names Aldridge never learned, they had formed a plan. Not a dramatic rescue. That would have brought swift and brutal punishment down on the innocent enslaved people at Heron's Bluff. Instead, they chose documentation. If they could create a written record, testimony, medical examination, witnesses, the secret could no longer be simply erased. It would become a fact. And facts, even in a world designed to bury them, had a stubborn way of surviving. In April 1844, Reverend Oakes returned for a second pastoral visit. He brought with him a quiet man he introduced as his assistant, in reality, Dr. Ansel Webb, the Charleston physician. The timing was perfect. Harlan Vance was away in Charleston for an agricultural board meeting. Eleanor was occupied with her visiting sister. The other overseer was busy on the far side of the property. Everything had been arranged. Aldridge led Oakes and Webb to the far end of the slave quarters in the clear mid-morning light. The guard that day was Cato, the same heavy-set man who had stood there on Aldridge's very first day more than a year earlier. Cato looked at the three approaching white men. His face remained unreadable. Arms crossed. Posture steady. The patience of a man who had long ago made peace with a duty he never chose. Aldridge stopped directly in front of him. He looked Cato in the eyes, not over his shoulder, not at the cabin, but at the man. And for the first time in years on that plantation, he spoke to him not as an overseer to an enslaved man, but as one human being to another. Cato, he said quietly, I know what's in there. I know how long it's been. We are not here to hurt anyone. We are not here to take anything that doesn't need to be taken. We only want to see. We only want to make a record so this cannot stay hidden forever. If you step aside, no one at Heron's Bluff will suffer for it. If you do not, we will leave. And there will be no punishment from me. Cato stood very still. The morning light filtered through the live oaks at the tree line, casting dappled patterns across the ground between them. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang its endless song. Cato's eyes moved from Aldridge to the two men behind him, then back. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the Spanish moss. Then, slowly, without a word, Cato stepped aside. The door to the guarded cabin, the door that had not been left unguarded for 23 years, stood open for the first time. What happened inside that cabin on that April morning would expose one of the most chilling acts of calculated human cruelty ever committed on Southern soil. And it would set in motion forces that Harlan Vance, for all his careful planning and blank-faced devotion to order, could never again control. Because some secrets, once seen by the light of day, refused to return to darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered away at a dead pine with slow, mechanical persistence, the only sound brave enough to break the heavy morning quiet. Then Cato stepped aside. The door to the last cabin, the door that had not swung open freely in more than 23 years, moved inward on its crooked hinges with a long, weary creak. It sounded less like wood and iron and more like something ancient finally exhaling after holding its breath for a lifetime. The air that rolled out was thick, close, and warm. It carried the scent of old tallow, wood smoke, and something far more intimate and haunting, the unmistakable smell of a human life that had never been allowed to leave its cage. A smell of skin, breath, and quiet suffering pressed into every board and corner until the cabin itself had become an extension of the body inside it. Dr. Ansel Webb stepped forward first. He moved with the deliberate calm of a physician who understood that some wounds are so deep that even the wrong tone of voice could cause them to tear open again. His hands stayed visible. His voice stayed low and steady, each word placed like a careful stitch. He spoke not as a white man giving orders, but as one human being addressing another who had been denied the right to be seen as human. In the far corner, on the low pallet, the young man sat perfectly still. The rocking had stopped the moment the door opened. He watched the strangers with the quiet, patient wariness of someone who had heard the door open many times before, always the same man, always the same routine, and had learned that stillness was the safest response. What Dr. Webb found, and what he later documented in a precise 8-page medical and observational report, was one of the most devastating indictments of human cruelty disguised as respectability ever recorded in the antebellum South. The person in the cabin was a young man, approximately 22 or 23 years old. Physically, he was in reasonable health. He had been fed regularly. His clothing was plain but clean and mended. He had not been beaten or starved in any obvious, visible way. Someone, Harlan Vance, had kept him alive with the same methodical efficiency he applied to maintaining his cotton gin or balancing his ledgers. But that was where any semblance of care ended. The young man had received no education whatsoever. He could neither read nor write. He had almost no language. Not because he lacked the physical ability to speak, Dr. Webb confirmed there was no defect in his throat or tongue, but because he had never had anyone to speak with in any sustained, meaningful way. His entire conscious life, from earliest memory, had been spent inside those 12 by 14-foot walls. He communicated through soft sounds and simple gestures, the language of a soul that had never been taught the words to name its own existence. He had known only one regular human contact, the weekly visits from Harlan Vance. These were not visits of a father to a son. They were inspections. Cold, functional checks to ensure the property remained alive and contained. Nothing more. And then there was the face. Even in the dim light, Dr. Webb noted it immediately. The resemblance to Harlan Vance was striking and undeniable, the same strong jawline, the same set of the eyes, the identical shape of the brow that appeared in the formal portrait hanging in the main house. This was no distant rumor. This was biological truth staring back at them. Harlan Vance had looked at his own son 22 years earlier and decided the most convenient solution was not to kill him, perhaps he lacked the stomach for outright murder, but to erase him. To place him in a liminal space between life and non-existence. Alive enough to breathe and eat. Invisible enough that the world could pretend he had never been born. A secret so perfectly maintained that even the guards had been trained, over years, not to think of him as a person at all. The document Dr. Webb prepared that morning was clinical, unflinching, and devastating. It described the young man's physical condition, his developmental state, the circumstances of his lifelong solitary confinement, and named Harlan Vance as the man responsible. It was signed by Webb, witnessed by Reverend Clement Oakes, and countersigned by Thomas Aldridge. Cato, who had stood silently in the doorway watching the entire examination, was quietly asked if he would make his mark on the paper. He stared at the document for a long time, longer than any of them expected. Then, with slow, deliberate pressure, he pressed a single line crossed by another into the page. A mark that carried the weight of every silent night he had spent guarding a door he had never been allowed to question. It was the only time in 23 years that anyone had asked Cato to acknowledge what he had been guarding. What followed did not happen with dramatic explosions or public trials. The machinery of concealment that Harlan Vance had built over 2 decades was too deeply embedded in the social order of South Carolina to collapse overnight. It came apart slowly, piece by piece, like a grand house settling on rotten foundations. The legal document itself had limited power in 1844 South Carolina. The young man was, after all, legally enslaved property. His confinement, no matter how monstrous, was not a crime the courts of that state were designed to punish. The entire system existed to protect men like Harlan Vance, not the souls they owned. But Reverend Oakes understood that law was not the only force in the world. Over the following months, he began to let the truth circulate quietly among the right circles in Charleston. Not loudly. Not in newspapers. Just enough a whispered conversation here, a carefully worded letter there, so that the knowledge began to spread through the planter class like smoke under a closed door. By the summer of 1844, certain invitations to the Vance household stopped arriving. Certain conversations grew awkward. Eleanor Vance's brother, the judge from Beaufort County, made a sudden 3-hour visit to Heron's Bluff in July. He left without staying for dinner. Harland Vance was visibly shaken afterward, a crack in the perfect blank mask Aldridge had never seen before. Thomas Aldridge left the plantation in August 1844. He gave proper notice, citing a desire to return to Virginia. Harland Vance accepted it without comment. On the morning of his departure, the two men shook hands on the veranda. The air smelled of warm fields and coming harvest. For a brief moment, Vance looked at Aldridge with an expression that was neither anger nor accusation, but something far more complex, perhaps the first faint stirring of shame, or simply the weary recognition that a secret kept for 23 years had finally slipped its chains and was now moving through the world beyond his control. Aldridge later wrote in a letter, "He knows. I do not know how much, but he knows something has changed. The secret is still unspoken in public, but it is no longer entirely his. And I believe he understands, in the way a man understands what he wishes he did not, that it never will be again." What became of the young man in the cabin remains one of the most haunting uncertainties in the entire story. In the fall of 1845, nearly a year after Aldridge's departure, the guard at the last cabin was quietly discontinued. The post that had stood unbroken for almost 25 years simply ended. The cabin stood empty for several months, door hanging slightly ajar, oilcloth window fluttering in the breeze like a surrendered flag. Later it was used for ordinary storage exactly as Harland Vance had always claimed. No record survives of what happened to the young man between the spring of 1844 and the fall of 1845. Whether he was moved to another hidden location, quietly sold far away, granted some limited and undocumented form of freedom, or whether he simply did not survive the exposure of his existence, none of it is known with certainty. He disappears from history as completely as his father had always intended. Harland Vance's own life began to unravel in slow, inexorable stages. Social invitations thinned. His presence on the agricultural board grew sporadic. Eleanor's family maintained a cool, unexplained distance. Vance himself became increasingly withdrawn, a ghost in the community he had once dominated so quietly and efficiently. He died in 1857 at age 65, officially of a fever. He left Heron's Bluff to his surviving legitimate son, who sold the property within 2 years. The plantation changed hands several times. By the Civil War it had been subdivided and partially abandoned. Fields returned to scrub. Buildings sagged into decay. The last cabin, the one with the crooked door and oilcloth window that had once required a living guard every hour of every day, burned to the ground sometime in the 1870s. Whether the fire was accident or deliberate, no one bothered to record. Reverend Clement Oakes continued his quiet ministry until his death in 1861, just months after the first shots at Fort Sumter. Among his papers was a sealed envelope containing a copy of Dr. Webb's document, labeled in his careful hand, "For the record, should anyone ever wish to know." Thomas Aldridge returned to Virginia and lived out his days managing a tobacco farm in the Shenandoah Valley. He never spoke publicly of what he had witnessed. His private letters, the primary source for much of this account, were discovered decades later among his granddaughter's effects and donated to a small historical society, where they sat largely unread for nearly a century. Cato, the man who had finally stepped aside that April morning, was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. He appears once more in a Freedmen's Bureau record from 1865. After that, silence. And the young man himself? His name, if he was ever given one beyond a number in a ledger, does not appear in any surviving document. He spent his entire life in a 12 by 14-foot cabin. He never saw the wide rivers or the live oaks draped in moss. He never felt rain on his face or heard children laughing or sat at a table sharing a meal with other human beings. He was reduced first to a problem, then to a secret, and finally to nothing more than a rhythmic sound in the darkness, the slow rocking of a soul that had been denied the right to become a person. In the end, What makes this story truly chilling is not the monstrous act of one man. It is how ordinary the machinery of that act was. How many people, overseers, enslaved workers, neighbors, family, heard the rocking at night, saw the constant guard, and simply chose not to ask questions because the cost of curiosity had been made too high. How a powerful man could maintain such a profound evil for 25 years in the middle of a busy working plantation simply by enforcing silence. Today, the land where Heron's Bluff once stood has been reclaimed by the lowcountry. Live oaks and sweet gum have swallowed the fields. The road to the big house is overgrown. The veranda where Harlan Vance once told his brother no one will ever know has long since returned to the earth. But somewhere in a quiet archive box, rarely opened, Thomas Aldridge's letters still survive. And in a Charleston lawyer's transferred record sits an 8-page document in a physician's precise hand. At the bottom of the final page, beside the signatures of 3 men who refused to let a life disappear entirely, is a single mark, a line crossed by another, made by a man named Cato who had guarded a door for years and then, on one ordinary April morning, chose to step aside. That mark is the only public testimony that any of them, or the young man they tried to save, ever existed. If this story has stayed with you, if you feel its weight pressing on your chest the way it pressed on Thomas Aldridge that cold November night, then you already understand why stories like this must be told. Not to shock. Not to entertain. But because some truths were buried with ruthless determination, and some truths still deserve to breathe in the light. What do you think happened to the boy in the cabin? Do you believe a man like Harlan Vance could truly live with himself? Tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from? And do you think this kind of silence could still exist today, hidden behind respectability and routine? If this story moved you, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share it with someone who needs to remember that silence has a cost. The land may have forgotten Heron's Bluff, but some secrets refuse to stay buried. We'll see you in the next one.